Today's reading comes from Luke chapter 20, verse 45, through to Luke chapter 21, verse 6. While all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honour at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. "Truly I tell you," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on." Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word.
Taking things out of context. I guess you may have heard that expression before. Politicians often use it when they are defending themselves. Boris Johnson recently had to use it when he was defending something that he had said. His response was that his words had been taken out of context. Of course, when you take words out of context, you often don't get the full or the true meaning of what someone is trying to say. For example, quite famously, the comedian Groucho Marx once said, "I've had a perfectly wonderful evening, but this wasn't it." Clearly, if you took out the second half of that sentence, you wouldn't get the full meaning. I've had a perfectly wonderful evening, but this wasn't it. And it's very important when we're reading the Bible to read it in context. And it's why I've asked Philip to read the verses around verses 1 to 4 today. So he's read 3 verses before the verses 1 to 4 of chapter 21 and 2 verses following that passage. So even though our focus is on those 4 verses in chapter 21, we've included some verses before and some verses after, so we can set the whole thing in its proper context, so we can get the true meaning. So the first thing we're going to see here, as we set this in context, is that Jesus was condemning the religious leaders. Jesus was condemning the religious leaders. Now that's not immediately obvious as you read these 4 verses, but as soon as you read the verse before, particularly, and perhaps the 3 verses before, but particularly verse 47 of chapter 20, you begin to see that this is included in the meaning. So verse 47 in particular, speaking about the teachers of the law, they do what? They devour widows' houses. Ignore the chapter break and read right on into the next chapter as if it were a continuation of the same moment almost. And you'll see that this incident with the widow is meant, certainly by Luke and indeed by God in his providence, to be an example of that verse 47, the devouring of widows' houses. Here's a widow whose life had been devoured or bled dry by the greedy religion of the teachers of the law. Jesus was here condemning that system that was devouring this widow and other widows and all weak and vulnerable people, bleeding them dry, taking away their money, their possessions, their houses, their estates. This was an example of that. Years ago, I was involved in a mission up in Scotland, and one afternoon I went out with someone else from the church to knock on doors and invite people to special events at the church. And I remember very well how one guy, as he opened the door to us, politely but very firmly rejected our invitation to the church. And he told us clearly that he thought that all the church was interested in was making money, taking money away from people. Was he right? Well, you could say, yes, that has happened, and it still does. The kind of church or religion that pretty much promises salvation or blessing if you give enough. They tell you that you can get blessing or even buy your salvation and even the salvation of your dead loved ones if you give enough to the church, to the temple, to the mosque, to the leaders, to the assembly. Then what happens, of course, is that they get richer and you get poorer. Jesus condemns that kind of religion, and we should too, and avoid it like the plague. It is a real temptation for church leaders or elders, especially those paid by the church, the temptation of making money out of what they do. Please pray for us that we would, here at Bow Baptist Church, not simply be doing the work, the ministry to make a living as religious professionals. I took a funeral last week and afterwards went for a while to the wake. After a while I made to leave, but I wanted to say goodbye to a particular person who'd helped to set up the funeral. But he hadn't turned up yet, so I hung around at the front door waiting for him to arrive, waiting to see him. However, one of the other people thought I was waiting to be paid for my services. He thought I was waiting to be given money before I would leave. I had made it clear to the guy organizing the funeral that I wouldn't take anything for what I'd done. But this guy didn't know that, and he said something like this to another person standing nearby. How much does he want? How much does the priest want? Talking of me as a priest. You see, it was like I was a religious professional, done a job, provided a service, said the words, get paid, go home. It can be possible to treat ministry in that way, as no more than a way to make a living, make money, do the ceremony, say the words, get paid, go home. Leaders of churches, especially paid leaders, are warned here, and more particularly, I think in 1 Timothy 6 and 1 Peter 5, to check our motives in ministry. I need to check my motives in ministry. Why am I doing this? Just to make a living until I can retire? Is it just a profession for me? Or is it for the glory of God and the salvation of people in Bow? The real temptation for Christian leaders. You see, there is a crazy idea that church leaders, pastors, elders aren't tempted the way normal people are tempted. I can assure you, we are. Please pray for us. Money is a very seductive thing for church leaders and for us all, and we should be on our guard against loving it and putting our hope in it. Second, I think we can see that Jesus is or was compassionate toward the widow. He refers to her as a poor widow. Verse 3, this poor widow, a word that means extremely poor, destitute. Here's a woman with just 2 tiny pennies in her pocket. Remember that in those times, widows were extremely vulnerable people. Probably she is reduced to begging, and all she got that day were those 2 measly pennies that someone has dismissively perhaps chucked at her, and it's all she has to live on. Notice how Jesus notices her. Most people would have ignored her. In fact, it's probably what she was hoping for, because if people did notice her, they would probably look down on her and her pitiful offering. But Jesus notices her as a precious human being and expresses compassion, at least at this point in his speech. You might ask, well, if he really has compassion on her, why doesn't he jump up and help her, save her from her destitution? Well, I guess he is leaving her for the moment to be an object lesson for his disciples, a teaching moment. But it doesn't mean that he won't be helping her later, or that he won't be entrusting her to his Father to watch over her and supply for her. Everything we know about Jesus means that his concern for her would not have been in words only. Jesus expresses compassion for her. Now, what do we do with this? Well, we can take it as an example for us to follow, to have compassion and care for the vulnerable people around us. And lockdown has in some ways given us more opportunity for that. Let's not lose that as we ease our way out of lockdown. Let's continue to have a special concern for the weak and vulnerable around us, especially in the church. So we can take that as an example for us to follow, but we can also take it as an encouragement for our faith. Just look at him. We know that Jesus was and still is compassionate, especially towards the vulnerable people, the old, the weak, the sick, those who feel ignored and alone, like this widow. Jesus notices you and watches over you and cares for you. You may feel like you have little to offer now, but he notices you and has compassion on you. He does not value you according to how much you have or how much you can do for him at the moment. So reflect on that and be encouraged. Third, I think he goes further than compassion, and he actually commends this widow. Not everyone agrees with this, but I think it's hard to read verses 3 and 4 without seeing some commendation, some approval from Jesus of the widow's actions. So that even if she has been, as some would say, conned into supporting a corrupt religion, the one that is being run by the teachers of the law, if she has been conned by supporting this religion, this temple that is soon to come under God's judgment, as we've seen before in Luke and as we'll see next time around in the later verses, as far as she is concerned, as far as we can see, she is giving to God in good faith. And though Jesus doesn't explicitly say, as he says of another woman in another place, she has done a good or beautiful thing, like I say, I cannot read those verses without getting some impression that Jesus is impressed with her or pleased with her. She has given her everything to God, all she had to live on, or the entire life that she has. It's a picture, isn't it, of someone entirely devoted to God. I like how one commentator says of her giving the 2 pennies, she might have kept one. She might have kept one, but she didn't. She gave them both. And Jesus noticed that and I think commended her for it. So a hen and a pig were strolling through a farmyard one day when a van went past with the words ham and eggs on the side. "You see," said the hen, "you and I are partners." "Yes," said the pig, "but for you, it's a day's work. For me, it's a total commitment." Total commitment. When I read things like this in the Bible, or it talks to me about total commitment, I tend to rationalize it a bit, saying things like, well, of course, no one can be totally committed to God. That's just impossible this side of heaven. But that doesn't mean it's not something we shouldn't aim for or work towards. As you see God revealed in Jesus here in Luke, is this not someone worthy, supremely worthy of our total commitment? And remember 2 Chronicles 16 verse 9. The eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. Should we not love him more, who has loved us so well? And he promises to strengthen our hearts when we are fully committed to him. Fourth and finally, notice how Jesus challenges his disciples. He challenges them about how they think, how they evaluate the situation before them. We too need to be challenged because we don't notice things like Jesus noticed things, and we don't value things like Jesus values things. See how he does that here in 3 and 4, and then again in 5 and 6. He challenges the way they think. The disciples looking on would naturally have valued the gifts of the rich much more than the paltry gift of the widow. And so would we. We are impressed, aren't we, when we see how wealthy people give large amounts to good causes. And of course, we don't need to despise that. But we see how Jesus turns it all upside down. He values and evaluates things very differently. He ignores the giving of the rich and highlights the giving of the poor widow. It's likely too, isn't it, that the disciples were also impressed by the fine clothes of the teachers of the law, the flowing robes, verse 46. Obviously, they were impressed later on in verse 5 by the magnificent temple of Herod, a place that deserved to be one of the ancient wonders of the world. I remember visiting Rome about 20 years ago with my wife, and at least feeling a little bit the pull, the temptation of the Roman Catholic religion, the magnificence of the cathedral, the wealth and splendor of the Vatican, the respect and honor given to priests and bishops and cardinals and so on. Not that I really want to swan around in flowing robes, but you get the idea. We too are impressed by the appearance of things. And so the widow looked very unimpressive, and her offering even less impressive. Most people would simply have ignored her or secretly dismissed her, ridiculed her even. But Jesus sees through the appearance to the reality of things. Giving is valued not by how much you give, but how much you don't give, how much you hoard, and by how much it costs you, really costs you to give what you give. It cost this widow everything. So Jesus challenges and changes their thinking, and he challenges ours too. Let me just draw out a few more things for us to think and talk about. A very basic thing, I think, that comes out of this is that we can give thanks for a better society. It's far from perfect, 21st century Britain, but in many ways it is better than that society because we do have some social security and some social care for poor and vulnerable people like widows. And in many ways, of course, our society has been shaped by Christianity, Christian values, beginning here in the Bible and in the teaching and the ministry of Jesus. It was not good that widows and orphans should be so bereft. In fact, it cut against the law of Moses in the Old Testament. And of course, the early church was tasked with taking special care of vulnerable people like widows. And our society, to some extent, has been built upon that Christian principle. And we give thanks for that, don't we? And of course, even though there is social security, we're aware that many people are struggling, particularly in these times of lockdown and post-lockdown. And we must still have that same care in the church today. You might remember how James wrote in his letter that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. It's that special concern for the vulnerable in the church. See 1 Corinthians 12. I want to say too that in one sense, or from one angle, you don't have to worry if you don't have much. I mean, it's not a sign that you're a lesser person if you don't have much money. It's not a sign that you're a worse person. It's not a sign that you're less loved or blessed or valued by God. Jesus does not judge or condemn the widow for putting in so little. Others looking on were probably thinking, how pathetic. What a poor gift. What difference is that going to make to the temple and the work of God? But Jesus sees it all so differently, and he renews their minds, and he resets the agenda once again. Being rich is not a sin, but nor is it a sign that you are more blessed by God, or loved by God, or favored by God. Your worth is not what you're worth in terms of how much money you have. Jesus was looking at this widow, it seems, with admiration and affection, not despising her or looking down on her because she was poor and helpless. And so finally, see in Jesus that leader, that shepherd that you really need and long for. The one who won't take advantage of you or con you or exploit you. He will not devour you, but he has come to give you life, life to the full. The one who is pure and good and kind. The good shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep, his people, because he loves them so very much. Two simple questions, or question suggestions to think and talk about later on. Firstly, what are you thankful for in our society? What are you thankful for in our society? And secondly, what would you pray for as a result of this message?